Hello everyone and welcome to Deconfine. Today we have with us Anushka Rajendran and I'm Proiti, and we also have Khayal. Khayal and I are the curators of Deconfine, and we are very excited to have Anushka with us today and to discuss the shifting digital culture in the arts in South Asia. And as I'm sure the ones who are watching already know Anushka, but we have to introduce her, of course. And there is so much that we want to learn from her today, and I'm sure that all of you who are listening share our interests. Anushka Rajendran is a curator and art writer based in New Delhi. She is the curator for the Prameya Art Foundation, a not-for-profit arts organization based in Delhi, committed to approaches that enable audience thinking for contemporary art in India. She is also the festival curator of the 2021 edition of Colomboscope and was the assistant curator for the Kochi Biennale in 2018. As a research scholar, Anushka is completing her PhD in visual studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. Her research traces how the notion of public has acquired alternative significance to contemporary Indian art since 2004. Her previous MPhil research focused on the adoption of installation art by artists in India in the early 90s to address collective and personal trauma. For her curatorial practice, she has been awarded fellowships that supported residencies across the world, and her contribution as an art writer and editor was recognized in 2015 when she received the Art Scribes Award for Emerging Mid-Career Art Writers of Indian Origin. Thank you for being with us here today, Anushka. We're very excited to have you here. And as someone, of course, that you are an inspiration for both of us, and we want to thank you, of course, not only for being here today, but also for the advice that you gave us when we are still building media at South Asia. So thank you for that as well. And without further ado, I think we can start talking about what we were here to talk about, what we are here to talk about. And before that, I think we would all like to know a little bit about your background. How did you enter this specific field, and how did your research interests and your curatorial approach develop over the years?
Thanks so much for having me here. It's a delight to be with both of you today, and I'm excited to be part of this platform as well. And congratulations on everything that you've been doing so far, which is phenomenal work. So to talk about how I started looking at these ideas is, I guess it started with my earlier research, my MPhil research on installation art in India, which kind of identified an uncanny contemporaneity between the early 90s and the political and cultural trauma that the nation underwent at that point of time, and a crisis in secular assumptions of the nation state at that point of time. And the sudden kind of, it wasn't completely sudden, that is not fair, because there were artists who were working in the 80s as well, whose practices could be retrospectively identified as working with installation art. But more or less, a lot of artists started moving towards installation to address crises within the national fabric. Even looking back at the partition and talking about it in a way that it hadn't been addressed until that point of time. Or to talk about, is the sound of the traffic interrupting our call at all? Okay. All right, so it was, yeah, so that's kind of how my interest in researching on contemporary art started. And then it moved to looking at curatorial narratives to address this body of research in interesting ways. But throughout this research, one question that was really, it kept coming back, a question that kept coming back was, yes, art can, the aesthetic realm can do so much, create all these narratives, but who are the publics that we are accessing, right? Because in India, often contemporary art is limited to a gallery going or a museum going audience, not even museums. There aren't that many museums either. So primarily a gallery going audience in bigger cities. So it was also kind of looking at what does it really mean? What kind of aesthetics are we proposing, and what kind of engagement is possible? And also the difference between categories such as audience and public, because audience is always a quantifiable entity. It's the number of people who we access. And I'll come back to this again as we talk more about digital culture and the way it exists in the art world right now. But yeah, it's always a quantified entity, whereas public is something that is that requires engagement. It's an engaged audience, right? So it's also about identifying the sensitive difference between both these groups and looking at as creative practitioners, what can we do to kind of initiate more engagement, not necessarily through social practice, which of course has a lot to do with it, but also looking at also looking at within the existing infrastructure in the arts, what can we do to kind of increase that kind of engagement. And in that context, I feel that especially now in a pandemic context where access to physical spaces are very limited, there is a lot of excitement around the digital. There is a lot of excitement around, again, the quantifiable audience that you can access through digital exhibitions within an online platform. And but again, how thought out is our work, is our collaborative collective work in our context, and how sensitive are we to the context, to the kinds of media audiences, and also the limitations of such engagement. Because I mean, again, when we talk about media art in India, it's very context specific, right? Because what we identify as media and technology, again, that's I'm sure you would have already encountered these conversations, but how new is new media, right? So, and what is new for different contexts, and how do we differently access it? Like, for instance, a lot of the internet users in a country like India primarily access the internet on their cell phones, and not necessarily, while they might have never ever used a laptop in their lives. So then how can we be sensitive to that interface and make it more accessible to such audiences? So these are questions that I feel that a lot of us as practitioners are still thinking through. I'm also still thinking through it and grappling with it in my work and challenging myself. And I know peers who are also doing similar work curatorially and artistically.
I mean, that's so true, because I mean, even technically, in terms of engagement, how to get to people, in terms of aesthetics, what format to use, I think it varies tremendously, especially in a country like India, because I mean, everything is so diverse that it's a huge challenge and very practical questions that we all are facing currently in the field. But following up to that, I wanted to ask also that what are the challenges, the institutional challenges in showing media art? Maybe we can begin the conversation there. And when I say showing media art both physically and digitally, because this is the current, this is, for example, a digital festival. So in both, what are the challenges in physical space and in a digital space? Maybe we can start from there.
Yeah, this is a question that artists are probably much more fit to address. But in my experience of having worked closely with artists, what I feel is that institutions in India are still not entirely prepared to show media art in a physical environment because of the technical requirements, and technology keeps changing. For instance, if you invest in equipment now, 3 years from now, that equipment could become outdated. So it's just that kind of rapidity and changing infrastructure that sometimes becomes very difficult to catch up to. It's also an infrastructural challenge that I feel art spaces are also hyper aware of and are trying to deal with, but it does impose restrictions on artists working locally in terms of the possibilities that they can explore within their own practice. I don't just mean video art, but if you're interested in VR or in the access to certain kinds of artistic production are limited. There's very little institutional support and funding for such projects. And even if you do manage to make the work, you may not be able to show it in the conditions that the work should perhaps be shown in. Whereas, again, it's interesting that you talked about the difference between, like, say, physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure for showing media art. Because what I realize is that when you work with a digital medium, there are limitations with how it's accessed, because it's not a controlled space that you're viewing the work in, right? Like a black cube or a white cube, or the kind of soundproofing that is required. Like for instance, if you're accessing a digital exhibition on your phone while you're traveling in a taxi, it kind of blends into your surroundings. Like for instance, if you're watching or if you're viewing a digital exhibition on your laptop, the number of other tabs that are open simultaneously on your computer and the kind of clutter that is simultaneous, it's not a clean space. It's not a space that you can take for granted. And it's also a space that has its own aesthetics, that has been established by how we use social media, how we use websites and Google, and also celebrity culture has defined internet usage to such a huge extent. So it's a space that we have started actively and at such a large scale using very recently. So there is a certain kind of consciousness of the space that you're working with. It's kind of like a site-specific exhibition. If you're not working with a white cube and you're working with a given space, the sensitivity to which you treat the history and the context in which the work will be shown is the same kind of sensitivity that a digital exhibition already requires. It doesn't matter if you have a white background to show the work in within the limitations of a screen, because that's never going to be an immersive experience. So these are some of the things that are interesting to consider, and these are challenges that institutions, I believe, are dealing with at the moment. And also because our institutions were never entirely media ready, there is also a tendency to, I feel, translate physical exhibitions to a digital medium as closely as possible to a physical visual representation of the work within a gallery space or an institutional space, right? So, and then again, working with the digital medium to show artworks is that you can't exclude artists working with paper, or just because it's not entirely apt for the medium, right? So then how do you kind of tailor the experience with complete honesty in a way that it acknowledges the limitations of the medium, but at the same time provides opportunity for a lot of us to engage with art, especially in a time when we can't physically see the work? I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I think like that brings us to, I think, the main issue that we are trying to sort of face and to address however we can, which is that when you are curating these online exhibits, so that, for example, the exhibition that you curated for the Shrine Empire Gallery, or at Colomboscope, the online series that you created. I mean, because of this extraordinary situation, I'm sure you had to consider factors that you had previously not considered. Some of them you already mentioned, both not just executing the exhibitions, but also the curatorial approach itself. I mean, I'm sure that you had to consider, and I'm assuming you had to be at home, you couldn't go outside, or even the artists who were creating the works for these exhibitions were also limiting any, I think, both mentally, psychologically, emotionally, as well as, in the physical space. I think so. I'm assuming that all of these factors that had previously never played any part in this process were now very important. And as you also mentioned about how this is not a clean space, and you're always competing with a lot of other kinds of material when you're in a digital space, and there's this end stream of media that we are all always sort of immersed in, and then trying to create a space for contemplation, for exploring a new kind of art form that maybe audiences who had previously not been interested in this may, new audiences as well. So what were these factors that you had to keep in mind when you were designing these different exhibitions?
A lot of the projects that I shared with you were worked on collaboratively with various institutions that I have had a role in over a long time. And even the Shrine Empire exhibition, it was something that was built. It was the first time. It was one of the earliest digital exhibition after the start of the pandemic. So it was also collaboratively done with the directors of the gallery and the team at the gallery in terms of envisioning how it should look, or what can we do in this time. And they were all experiments in that sense. But it's interesting that you use the word competing, because I've never thought of it as competing. I've always thought of it as a populated space, accessed on a populated interface, rather than, because when we use the word competing, then we are again kind of using a certain kind of vocabulary that may not entirely be appropriate within artistic practices. For instance, like you might say that a social media post got the maximum engagement as opposed to others. So then again, we're kind of falling back on the distinction between audiences and public. So what do we really want? Do we want audiences, or do we want engaged publics for the work that we do? That's, I think, a fundamental question that a lot of us as practitioners kind of need to think about and resolve. Because audiences, just having the number has its own benefits as well. I'm not saying it doesn't. But it's just about situating practices. Like, for instance, I remember working on a proposal for an exhibition which was never realized several years ago. And I was talking to a colleague about it, and it was a project that was a larger scale. And she mentioned that, you can say, you need to figure out whether you need a large exhibition to make a point, or if a single artistic commission with accompanying text can perhaps do a lot more than that. So it's not always about scale in that sense. And I feel like that is something else that this sudden transition towards digital spaces to exhibit artwork has made us aware of, because a lot of things are not possible at the same scale. Or even if a work is of a much larger scale, the way it's accessed is, again, something that is in your control, right? Something that's on your desktop, or something that you hold in your hand. So so I feel that these are some of the things that are interesting to think about while figuring out interfaces that are appropriate for each framework. Like, for instance, when I did the Shine Empire exhibition, speculations on a new world order, it was at a time when they had just announced a lockdown in India, and there was so much going on politically, socially, and then there was a sudden shift because of the health crisis. And there were a lot of ideas that I wanted to kind of articulate in conversation with artists, and to kind of also resolve certain things in my own thinking. And what I realized is that it wasn't fully conscious, but it ended up being so that a lot of the works included photography, right? Because photography was in many ways an already ready medium for this interface, in a way that a painting wouldn't be, or something else wouldn't be. And I also realized that a lot of the early viewing rooms at the start of the pandemic focused entirely on video art. So I feel like this has pointed us towards new directions and possibilities for perhaps showing video art in our context, when infrastructurally we may not be as ready in a physical space as larger museums in the West or other contexts. Sorry.
If I may, I mean, what you pointed out about me using the word compete. I mean, we are so trained, we're so socialized in this capitalist culture that that's something I really I didn't think it. That's just how I phrased it. But that also makes me wonder, like, when you are curating an exhibition for purely a digital space, how do you assess or gauge the impact of that then, without falling into the trap of looking at numbers, or so how do you view that? How do you understand the impact of a digital exhibition?
I think a good example to use here would be the series of exhibitions that the institution that I curate for in Delhi, Prameya Art Foundation, has been doing during the pandemic, PRAF Discover. So it was an effort from the directors of the institution to support younger emerging artists who may not have enough spaces to show their work during this time. So it was always interesting, because initially it was like it is an exhibition every month. And so that kind of schedule also allows for regular feedback in a way. So there were certain exhibitions that certain parts of the artistic community responded to quite strongly and wrote to us saying that we are so glad that the space has been able to support such work in a time like this. And it was also a way for us to kind of actively challenge the limitations of the digital medium, showing performance-based work, site-specific work, even if it's through photography on that platform. And it was interesting because people do actually respond to it. Like one of the, it's a tricky situation, but since we are the cultural practitioners right now in our context are relatively a smaller community, so it's also easy to kind of gauge access in terms of who writes to you or who reaches out to you. And a lot of the time, one of the things that I found really interesting early on when I was thinking about audiences and engagement were YouTube comment sections, in terms of how dynamic it can sometimes be, sometimes entirely superfluous, but the idea of active conversation close to media content and in relation to it and the different directions that it may take. So I feel like these are possibilities that we could kind of figure out going forward, like possibilities for collective viewing and collective encounter of. And sometimes the aesthetics of a medium itself can accommodate impact in ways that, like for instance, when Camp started working with CCTV footage for their work, which was all like from cell phones that the actors within their project already had, and using that kind of footage, so your primary audience is already responding even within the framework of the work. So especially with social practice, I feel like there are primary publics, contingent or community-based publics that are actively engaged in the making of the work, collaborating with the artist consistently, in which case the primary audience for that work is already the community or the contingent public that they are working with, right? And then their feedback and their response to it is already accommodated within the work itself, which makes it a lot more democratic rather than the idea that somewhat modernist idea that an artwork is an enshrined object that you always approach with awe and then the fetishized idea of encounter, which is still true to a lot of work, but there are works that can transcend that to kind of incorporate within the medium. And then again, it's interesting. I'm glad I brought up Camp because just to make one more point. It's I think there's some of the very early on. I mean, these are ideas that I started grappling with very recently, like working so actively with the digital medium. But they have been thinking about how to match the aesthetics of how to match the aesthetics of a work with the aesthetics of the medium that we are using, and also what it means to make work for a hyper-connected mediatic universe that we navigate on a daily basis. Does that answer?
No, I was just going to mention that, and in fact, the kind of work that you describe, which already includes the participation of the public within it. We have a work like that in our exhibition as well, Charbagh by Faisal Anwar. It has gone live recently, so I mean, I would welcome you also to take a look, and everyone watching also.
Definitely.
And taking the conversation forward, Anushka, I mean, so till now we discussed a little bit about how to have engagement with the audiences and the impact of online exhibition, and basically in a space like India as to how to curate physically and digitally exhibitions to engage audiences, and not just for numbers, but actually engage them critically into what we are currently trying to do. But I also have a question regarding, because it's something which we personally faced during this festival, which is that now I'm talking about the relationship between the artist and the curator and the role between that. So, for example, as you also briefly mentioned initially, that sometimes you, like, if it's a digital platform that where you're exhibiting the works, what do you do with artists who are primarily dealing with fine arts or sketches and drawings, and how, for example, in that case, how would you bring those art forms, artworks into a digital space, even though they might be media art, but are not suitable for digital platforms or web-based platforms. So one of the artworks in this case that I'm talking is of Parvati Nair, which is also part of the festival, wherein it's basically hand drawn with graphite on wood that she did. And what we try to do is that we photograph those works, and then instead of showing them as a gallery, we tried to create a video art with that, because we could somehow in a virtual space also compare different artworks with each other and play around the scales of it. This was just one example of how probably we dealt with that. But I wanted to ask you that in your practice, if you came across such challenges as to how do I showcase something which is probably not meant for the web-based platform, but you still have to, and how do you engage with that?
There is a lot of back end to a lot of these digital exhibitions that we don't always foreground, right? And I feel that this is definitely one of it. But the way I would perhaps approach it, if allowed, is looking at process. Because process is something, especially the drawing, process is something that documentation can capture and convey in a way that, so it's always not, again, we come back to the idea of translating the experience of an artwork for a digital medium. So if we start from the audiences that we are engaging and the conditions within which they're viewing it and the possibilities that are available, if we start backwards, I think it will be possible to identify possibilities with that perhaps wouldn't be really accessible if we were showing the work the way it was intended to. For instance, if you're showing drawing, like it might be interesting. This is something that we have been doing through Held Apart Together for Colomboscope as well, is like, and also Prameya Art Foundation to an extent, is looking at process, right, and the making of the work. There is something that can be very intimately captured about that experience in a way that it can't necessarily be, like, so I think it's also about looking at possibilities like this. Like, for instance, when I did that, I think I shared it with you, I did a commission for Abra with Salman Bashir. And so that was interesting because I was working with an artist who's living in Kashmir with 2G internet that barely works. So we did multiple test runs of the performance before and after. And it was going to be shown on social media, which was like the Instagram and Facebook platforms for Agra. So when you're working with a context that is excluded from our digital accessible, environment, then how do you include that? How do you embed the aesthetics of that remoteness into the format of the work itself? So that was a possibility that emerged because I was working with an artist, and we collaboratively faced this particular challenge, because very often when you work with video-based artworks or performance documentation, there is this kind of already assumed emphasis on the quality of the video file or the resolution or all of these other aspects at play. And so it was about subverting that in a way and consciously embedding the lack of possibilities within the work and embedding it into the aesthetics of the work. So I feel that it's always relative. It depends on the project, it depends on the artist and how open they are, and to multiple interpretations of the work. And because sometimes there might be a very specific idea that the artist wants to communicate, and without that the work can't hold on its own. So I don't think that a lot of works can necessarily fit with this variable approach, but I think that it's very relative within the work. It's about thinking through the possibilities that might emerge in the absence of others.
I mean, I think it's also, as you said, it's extremely relative to the artist, to the artwork, to also the relationship between the curator and the artist and the context that it is being talked about. But I also find it very interesting, even as an idea, that an artwork is represented on digital platform, let's say in a different particular form than what it was intended to initially, which transformed the artwork. And then the question of, is it the same artwork or is it's a completely different experience?
Yeah.
And as you also briefly mentioned initially, that since the viewing space for audiences is different. Like every smartphone, every dimension of the screen is different. So the perception and the experience of the artwork also differs from person to person, from internet connection to the speed that they have. So I mean, it varies so much that it's hard to come down to one rule or one right way to choose.
Yeah.
Obviously how to navigate through all this uncertainty which we have around us.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I feel that going forward, now that we have become, we've been forced to become a lot more adaptable towards digital formats for showing work in our context. I feel that going forward, we might see a lot of work that is specifically made for that kind of consumption. Right, because then you're already anticipating, so the work is already ready to be vulnerable to the circumstances, the varied circumstances in which it might be consumed.
Yeah.
I think that's the only real way to, it's kind of when you have a challenge, it's about incorporating, because the challenge, you can't hide it, right? Because then you're pretending it doesn't exist at all. But if we kind of incorporate it within the work, then a lot more possibilities might emerge, I feel.
And that kind of also brings us to probably one of the last questions, or second last. I don't know, I mean, if you want to continue, we can. But that how the challenges that we currently are facing, I mean, in terms of as a society, with the pandemic, would you say that it has sort of pushed the role of has pushed the field of media arts forward and accelerated those things on that end? Because I mean, we're seeing like a lot of digital art festivals coming up in past few months. And do you think that this change or this shift which is happening currently, this acceleration will remain even after the pandemic hopefully resolves soon?
Well, we need to really find out about that. But I feel that the more we keep speaking about this, and it becomes a way to kind of put that idea out there. Like, I know that Serendipity is more, their current digital art festival is very conscious about the possibilities of media art within the context in which it is consumed, and you all have been doing this festival as well. So I feel, yes, it is possible that we might head in that direction more and more. And also, hopefully, at this point, we can recognize our own limitations in terms of spaces being able to infrastructurally support certain kinds of work. And now that a lot of institutions and galleries are more prepared to go digital, they can perhaps come up with alternative solutions for showing such work, commissioning such work, supporting artists who primarily work with new media forms. And that, I feel, is a very likely possibility. And also thinking about, and also the politics of the space, right? Because when we talk about the internet, it's already, at least the part of the internet that we usually occupy there's so much data mining, and it really, reduces. So there's a lot that it does to your identity, the way it traces your patterns of consumption, the algorithm that kind of guide you to everything, and also the capitalist ethics that is perpetual on internet interfaces. So it's also about thinking about the politics of that space, and perhaps trying to subvert it, or perhaps trying to create alternative spaces, alternative formats that can coexist in a space like that. I think these are ideas that we need to probably start thinking more closely going forward. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're saying, that's exactly what I was thinking about. How, I mean, yes, the internet as we know it is the product of a number of capitalist practices, and we are all embedded in it. But the fact that we are trying to reclaim at least a little bit of that space through these exhibitions and these conversations, I mean, that there has to be some value in that, right? I mean, at least in the attempt. And also something I want to ask you, because as an outsider to this whole the world of the arts, I mean that's how I see myself. And I want to ask you as an insider, do you think there is any danger that, or do you think there is any tendency in any section of this this art world, which views digital exhibitions as somehow lesser than, because we have this tendency to always view things in a hierarchy, and like for example online education is often seen as being, you know, like a shadow of the real thing, or you know, we always tend to have these kind of preconceived notions and prejudices about the online space or something that's different. So do you think there is any tendency like this in the arts space?
I honestly don't think so going forward, because I feel like those hierarchies are being inverted more and more going forward. Because even right before the pandemic, I felt that there were a lot of people who would just look at Instagram images if they're not able to make it to a physical exhibition, right? So I feel like we consume so much digitally these days that it's probably perhaps more of a habit to access exhibitions on a digital medium than otherwise. Of course, it is frustrating because scale is always something that is just impossible to really accurately convey on digital. At least I haven't figured out a way to do it yet without like video footage or and so there are a lot of these things that are of course frustrating and limiting compared to a physical exhibition. And I think that physical exhibitions are very much necessary as well, because just the joy of just seeing the materiality of a work, or even if it's a video art, just being immersed in a space where you can be consumed by it is of course definitely unparalleled. So I do hope for a return to physical exhibitions, but I doubt if there will be a sharp hierarchy, because it just might, like for instance, if we're talking about audiences, it might be very possible to get more audiences for a digital exhibition rather than a physical one. Like for instance, at Prameya Art Foundation recently, we hosted an exhibition by Shaunak Mahbubani, a curated exhibition. It was a fantastic exhibition, but not a lot of people got to come to the physical space to actually view it. But there was a digital version, and a lot of the reviews and the show was written about by people who had never actually seen the exhibition, like critical, in-depth reviews, who had never actually even seen it, without really necessarily feeling that they perhaps did not fully get a sense of the project by not being present. But tell me about your experience working during this time, curating a large international digital exhibition. Like, what were the challenges you faced and had to work through in that sense?
I mean, for, honestly, it's been a roller coaster ride for both of us from past 2 months. But we're extremely happy the way things are turning out. But I mean, I think we did cover like a lot of questions which we personally had and which we faced during the curation of the festival, starting from how to represent or how to transform or how to portray an artwork in a digital space, and what was the best way. Because I mean, the experience still is not really in our control. It's an open space for artists to consume the art in the way they want to. Um, so I mean that was a big challenge working with, let's say, Parvati Nair, working with Justin Emard, who works predominantly with performances with AI, and the conversations that we had with her in the curation of how to present her artwork was that, for example, she has these massive like basically video installations but of crazy scale that she does, and that scale matters a lot in a controlled space because that does something to your body. It's much more than just a visual and sound thing. And to, let's say, show it that on your screen on your mobile phone with, let's say, 480p SD quality, I mean it's not the same at all. So what to do there? And so questions related to the questions related to this have bothered us since many days, and I think they will continue to do so in coming years as well, because I think these are important questions as to how to use this space. But at the same time, I do want to come to the fact that the digital or the web-based platforms, if you understand them correctly and if you understand them, their possibilities, you can do much more and in ways that probably is not possible physically.
Yeah.
And that is also very interesting because that is something which I think the place,
Sorry, I lost
the
you for a
digital.
second. Can you say that again?
Yeah, I'm saying that that is also where somewhere the physical and the digital cannot be compared because
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
what you can do on a virtual platform, you probably would never be able to do it on a physical space.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
very specific to the medium that we are using. And
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point that you mentioned, and it would be great to see the kind of work that you keep doing in the future as well, to see how much you would be able to adapt it to, ideally suit a completely. Perhaps we can even invent something that is radical and has never been done before as a viewing experience, because we're all learning and experimenting as we go along, I feel. So lots of possibilities.
hopefully,
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think, and I mean, this is just the beginning of the pandemic. So, I mean, I think we are in for the long haul. And then, as terrifying as that sounds, I mean, sometimes people can be the most creative when they're under pressure. So, I think as a whole, like, we have to adapt and move forward with this. With that, I think we have come to the conclusion of this conversation. Anushka, thank you so much for being part of this, and we hope that you will continue to humor us when we ask you questions or for advice or information. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has been with us today. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you look at both our exhibition and also the many exhibitions that Anushka has curated that are all up for viewing. So with that, I think we will conclude here.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a nice day. Thank you so much, Anushka.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here, and good luck and congratulations on all that you've done so far.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Can you